Hello, and welcome to Folk Files, a podcast that explores both the history of folk music and the ways that folk music has shaped history, as we'll see in this episode. The Baltic singing revolution refers to the period of time between 1986 and 1991, when Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia erupted in a series of non-violent protests against the Soviet Union that were primarily driven by music festivals, patriotic songs, and large singing demonstrations. But if I were to only discuss those 5 years in Baltic history, it wouldn't paint the full picture. The Baltic countries have been using songs to fight for their independence for centuries. In the background, you can hear Mu isamaa on minu arm, My Homeland is My Love, an example of a song that has been used for over 100 years as an unofficial national anthem for Estonians fighting for independence. This version is from the 2019 Estonian Song Festival. I don't think I'm alone in that I never learned about any of this in school, and so during the course of this episode, I will attempt to give an engaging summary of the power of music in the Baltic states, and at the same time, continue to expand our collective definition of folk music. But first, here are some words from Basic Folk. Earlier this month, I did an episode swap with Basic Folk, so if you haven't yet, feel free to listen to Basic Folk's devilishly delightful interview with Carolyn Kendrick in the Folk Files feed.
Basic Folk features honest conversations with folk musicians hosted by Cindy Howes and Lizzie No.
Basic Folk approaches these interviews with warmth, with humor, and most importantly, with insightful questions.
Since 2018, this podcast has fostered the folk community and showcased a genre that is often misunderstood.
Has it really been since 2018? Well, no wonder our definition of folk is so extremely broad. We have an entire constellation of guests. And you're going to hear all of these stars sharing their stories, from 3-time Grammy winners like Molly Tuttle.
We had this funny thing we'd say in the studio, like, make us ACUS, so make us Allison Krauss and Union Station, because they're like our heroes.
You're going to hear from modern Haitian American folk legends like Layla McCalla.
I think it's wild how little Haiti is spoken of. It is so much a part of the world that we live in.
And really deep feelers, like John Hyatt.
I am going to ask you about your feelings. Hope you're ready.
I'm sorry, I can't go there.
Basic Folk is so pleased to be an official production of the Bluegrass Situation. Thanks for listening, and welcome to Basic Folk.
Over the next 25 minutes or so, I will primarily be discussing Estonia. There are a few reasons for that. First of all, Estonia stands out from all of its neighbors, even Latvia and Lithuania, in that its language does not have Indo-European roots. Instead, it comes from the Finno-Ugric branch of languages, which also comprises Hungarian and Finnish. This is important when it comes to music because, as we'll see in a moment, the rhythms and quirks of Estonian have led to a very specific style of folk music. Also, Estonia arguably has the strongest musical tradition of the 3 countries, which is saying a lot since all the Baltic nations have a culture that's deeply tied to music. As the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict points out, though one of the world's smallest countries, as of 2009 the population is estimated at approximately 1.3 million, Estonia has one of the world's largest repertoires of folk songs, and the Estonians have used their music as a political weapon for centuries. Finally, the bulk of my research for this episode was driven by Ramona Holmes' Resilient Voices, a book that mainly focuses on Estonian song festivals, especially in displaced persons camps in Germany. Thank you to Folk Files listener Cliff, who requested this episode and who pointed me towards her work. Let's begin with a brief overview of Estonian history. The term Eesti, which is what Estonians call Estonia, first appeared in writing in the 1st century. Tacitus describes the Eesti in his work Germania, and while it was likely that the Eesti were just a tribe at that time, the people in that region already appeared to have a strong identity. By the 13th century, what is now Estonia was being controlled by Germanic forces. In the 16th century, Sweden took over, and the area was known as the Duchy of Estonia. In 1721, the territory was ceded to Russia. So it wasn't until Estonia gained independence from Russia in 1917 that the area officially became an independent country. Their independence only lasted for a little over 20 years, and then World War II began, and Estonia was juggled back and forth between the Soviets and the Nazis. After the war, Estonia was swallowed into the Soviet Union, and they didn't gain their independence again until 1991, after the Singing Revolution. For its entire history, however, Estonia has had a strong sense of culture that was tied to music. Their folk music tradition is called Kiigelaul, which roughly translates to verse song. There were rarely any instruments in this style of music because Estonian peasant life didn't allow for much time for learning instruments, but occasionally you could hear bagpipes or fiddle or the Estonian zither known as the KANNEL, which you can hear here. Kiigelaul could be used for working, since there were songs for harvesting and herding, for rituals, or simply for recreation. The style of Kiigelaul is unique in that the lyrics decide the rhythmic meter. Estonian emphasizes the first syllable of every word, so in order to make sure the stress is in the right place, the syllabic melodies had to change meter. Kiigelaul often had refrains. For example, wedding songs often repeated kaske, kaske, which was a reference to the birch tree, an important wedding symbol. The songs were either sung in unison or in 2 to 3 part harmony, but crucially, they were sung communally. Often, Kiigelaul would feature a song leader who would improvise lyrics, and the rest of the chorus would join in on the final couple syllables. As an English speaker, this sounds a little difficult. How can you be sure that the chorus would be able to accurately guess the last couple syllables of your improvised line? But Estonian is an agglutinative language, which means that words are composed of building blocks called morphemes. Because of the rules governing those building blocks, it's easy to guess what the final sounds of a line will be. Here's an example of this style of Kiigelaul. This song, here performed by school children on the island of Hiiumaa, was originally sung while swinging on a swing. When Estonia came under Swedish rule, Lutheranism was introduced to the region, and with it came European religious hymns. Unlike traditional Estonian songs, European hymns have a regular rhythm. Also, they emphasize a harmonic progression where Kiigelaul moves around a tonal center. Lutheran hymns put more of an emphasis on multiple voice parts as well. Despite the major differences, Estonians embraced polyphonic sacred singing and started making it their own. At first, they simply translated the lyrics of existing hymns written by people like Bach, but soon composers began writing melodies that were adapted to the Estonian language. Here is an example of a hymn whose lyrics and tune were both written by Estonians, L. Raudkepp and J. Aavik, at the turn of the 20th century. In the past, when I've tried to think about types of music that are categorically not folk music, I've tended to think of classical music, or more broadly, choral music. After all, it's often associated with the elite, it's not as easily accessible as what we think of as folk music, and it's usually written down, whereas folk music tends to be tied to oral tradition. But researching Baltic choral music has completely changed my mind. Choral music and folk music seem to be intertwined. The Baltic identity is tied to its choral music traditions, which imbues these more classical-sounding songs with a folk spirit. While researching Estonian hymns, for example, I kept seeing the songs described as folk hymns. The Estonian choral style is characterized by somewhat homorhythmic lines, since a lot of the music was designed to be sung by large choirs, and if all the parts sing different rhythms in a large choir, things can get a little muddy. The Estonian choral style also emphasizes vowels and tends to feature frequent meter changes, since Estonians stress the first syllable of each word. For this reason, you can find a lot of eighth note triplets and quarter note triplets. Another common characteristic is alternating male and female voices. Here's a good example of what you can expect from a typical piece of Estonian choral music from composer Mihkel Ludig. Some composers were also folk song collectors and worked regulaul into their choral pieces. For example, this is a weaving song adapted to be a choral arrangement by Hoia. And this is an example of an old folk text written in an obsolete dialect that was set to choral music by composer Mart Saar. Again, it's hard to form any kind of meaningful line between Estonian folk music and Estonian choral composition. What's interesting about the Estonian style of composition, though, is that, at least at the beginning, it didn't develop in Estonia. Lower classes were not allowed to attend university in Estonia for a long time, a rule that continued long after the feudal system was dismantled. So instead, any common person who wanted to study music usually ended up going to the St. Petersburg Conservatory. So the center of Estonian musical learning was arguably Russia, until 1919, when the Tallinn Conservatory opened in Estonia's capital city, just a couple years after Estonia declared independence. Perhaps one of the most famous people to come out of the Tallinn Conservatory was Arvo Pärt. This is a little of his Tabula Rasa from 1977. Now let's take a step back in time and talk about the first Laulupidu, or Song Festival, in Estonia. It was organized in 1869, when Estonia was still under Russian rule, in order to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the end of serfdom. Russian lords tried to delay or cancel the festival because they recognized that it was the perfect way to stir up new initiatives for independence. They ultimately failed to stop the event, and the festival indeed became a reminder of the rich culture of Estonia and the catalyst for a nationalist movement. Historians say that the first Laulupidu marked the start of an era called the Time of Awakening, when Estonians began pushing for independence. Laulupidus were held in subsequent years under Russian rule, and the Estonians had to play a few political games. For example, the 1880 festival was specifically marketed as a birthday celebration for Alexander II of Russia so that they could make sure the Russian officials would sign off on it. They usually would have to perform songs that were specifically dedicated to the Russian Tsar or that thanked Russian officials. But still, the cry for independence was heard under the Russian propaganda. As an Estonian World War II refugee said in 1947, particularly important were the first song festivals that took place in the era of foreign rulers. Through song festivals, the Estonian people ignited a sense of nationality. The song festivals affirmed their faith in the spiritual power and life of the Estonian people and encouraged them to fight for nation and national rights. The song that you heard at the very start of the episode, Mu isamaa on minu arm, was written for that first Laulupidu in 1869. However, at that time it had a different tune, composed by Alexander Kunneleid, and sounded like this. That was sung by the Tartu Boys Choir. The Laulupidu continued to happen every 5 years. 4 Laulupidus occurred during the age of Estonian independence, and they were very well attended. But then, the war came. Estonians near the Russian border were drafted into the Soviet army, and then the Soviets invaded in 1940 and took over Estonian farms and sent anyone who dared to stand in their way to Siberia or killed them. Even in the middle of war, the Soviets began spreading propaganda. They took over Estonian schools and made schoolchildren sing Russian songs, but you can always count on cheeky children to rebel. Ramona Holmes writes that Estonian Enid Verkammer recalled that she and her friends would sing the Russian national songs in school with a few purposeful mispronounced words or carefully replaced words. The songs came out the same phonically, but the words were either humorous or politically anti-Russian in tone. Many musicians and music teachers, being naturally outspoken and political, were targeted and sent to Siberia or managed to escape. In 1941, the Soviets retreated and the Nazis swept in. Reading about Estonian history challenged my belief that every person in the Nazi army was by definition a bad person. I was just following orders is not a good excuse for being a member of the Nazi army. But what about, I had to join the Nazi army or else I would have been killed along with my family for being Russian sympathizers? The Nazis drafted the Estonians into their ranks and killed anyone who resisted, claiming they were in league with the Soviets. Some Estonians were able to escape enlistment or execution and joined the guerrilla army called Metsavened, which translates to Forest Brothers, which I think is the coolest name for a guerrilla army I've ever heard. Others were able to flee the country. Overall, due to death and deportation, Estonia lost 25% of its population. So what happened to all the Estonians who were able to escape? Many of them ended up in displaced persons camps in Germany at the end of the war. And, despite numerous letters written to the Allied forces from desperate Estonians, the Allied forces failed them. Estonia was handed over to the Soviet Union as part of the post-war negotiations. And that didn't just mean that Estonians would have to call themselves Soviet citizens. The Soviets accused many Estonians of being traitors, since their land, and sometimes bodies, had been seized by the Nazis. Many were sent to the gulags or were killed outright. Being arrested by the Soviets was such a horrific fate that many Estonians committed suicide, and many more Estonians fled the country and ended up in displaced persons camps. The camps existed in different zones run by the English, Americans, French, and Soviets. Obviously, the Estonians avoided the Soviet zones. They aimed for the English and American zones, which were known for unofficially avoiding forced repatriation. As Ben Shepherd writes, American leaders were encouraged to quietly ignore the Soviet line that all people originating from the area within its new borders were Soviet citizens. That was a lot of dark history, so I think it's time for a brief musical break. This is a song by Miina Harma, a composer who wrote over 200 choral songs over the course of her life. In the displaced persons camps, there were over 175 professional musicians, along with many other creative types like actors and writers. The refugees had a lot of time on their hands. They also had to rely on the Allied authorities for a lot of things. As Holmes writes, Estonians were used to being self-reliant and were uncomfortable having to accept so much charity. As a way to lift spirits, avoid idleness, and, arguably, give back to the Allied authorities, they began forming choirs. A Baltic university was established in Germany for the refugees, and of course, many churches sprung up. The university choir and worship choirs quickly followed. But one of the first choirs established for its own sake was formed in 1945 under the direction of Aino Magi. It was an all-female group, and Magi explained, "In the beginning, I organized a group of young ladies to sing light songs. Everything was done by memory." They performed for the Allied authorities, and the first song they ever sang was Lepalind, a song about an alder bird. That version was sung by El Taber. Magi's choir, along with other choirs, would often attempt to dress in traditional Estonian folk costumes. In at least one case, their garb was made from surplus war parachutes. As Magi said, everything was done originally by memory and was handwritten because most people had to escape their homes quickly and didn't have time to grab sheet music. Musical directors would write down voice parts that they remembered or just made them up. They were able to mimeograph some of the music, a form of duplication using a stencil. Then, they would distribute the music around the various Baltic displaced persons camps. However, paper was hard to come by. If you check out the episode art that I posted on social media and Patreon, you'll notice that it features a piece of sheet music with some strange markings at the bottom. That's an old order form from the Nazi Air Force that was repurposed as sheet music. The song notated sounds like this. The Estonians in the displaced persons camps did have access to some music scores from their homeland, however, thanks to Roman Toi. Toi was a refugee who somehow managed to think quickly enough to stuff a suitcase full of photographed music scores on film when he fled the Russians. Speaking of people who had their priorities straight, composer and choral conductor Albert Edward Prux was one of the Estonians who ended up in the displaced persons camps. His daughter Inga explained why he left, saying that, yes, he had engaged in political activities that put his life in danger, but also he complained bitterly at hearing only Russian music on the radio and vowed to only return when Estonia was free again to express its own soul through its own music. In 1947, a song festival was organized in the displaced persons camp. Holmes explains one of the main purposes of the festival, saying, "A key function of the program was to present Estonian culture to the rest of Europe." After all, if everyone recognized the Baltic nation's distinct cultural identity, perhaps there would be a larger international push to pull Estonia out from under the Iron Curtain. Of course, another reason for the festival was morale. People from many different camps gathered together. Estonian song festivals always feature a parade, and this one was no different. Children carried maypoles in the parade, decorated with depictions of oak leaves and kannels, and festival hosts fed the choir members soup and rye bread, as was traditional. The first song of the festival was A Mighty Fortress is Our God, a Lutheran hymn. Estonians weren't the only people in attendance. Allied authorities also attended, and local Germans even embraced the festival, which was impressive considering that many of the displaced persons camps were formed on land taken from local Germans. As one German journalist wrote after the festival, Estonians and song are inseparable. The ancient traditions tell us that the Estonians have always been a vocal people. Many choirs from different camps were in attendance, and the repertoire included folk songs, new compositions, traditional choral music, folktale arrangements, and national songs. The national songs were arguably the most important, because the Estonian refugees knew that those anthems were not being sung back at home. There was a Laulupidu in Estonia in 1947, but it was strictly controlled by the Soviets, and all signs of nationalism were banned. At the very end of the Laulupidu at the displaced persons camp, the performers sang a song that was not in the program. Tuuliak is an Estonian wedding song that is traditionally sung at the end of the singing festivals. The attendants clamored for it, and finally, the performers sang it from memory. Here it is from the 2019 Laulupidu. It may seem like an odd choice for the final song. It's very joyful and upbeat, and it's kind of a tongue twister. It's considered a rite of passage for many Estonian singers. But that's what the people needed. They needed levity and joy and hope. It was starting to become evident that they would not be able to return to their homeland anytime soon. And sure enough, many of them never returned. They immigrated to Australia or Canada or the United States and formed Baltic communities there, sometimes complete with their own song festivals far away from their native land. Meanwhile, back in Estonia, the Laulupidu continued with a lot of restrictions until the 1980s. Moscow made Estonians sing songs praising Lenin and Stalin at the song festivals. The Soviet Union banned the wearing of traditional costumes and banned the Estonian flag. There were, of course, people who protested. In 1969, the crowd began singing Mu isamaa on minu arm over and over, even though the Soviets tried to drown them out with a brass band. But protesting was illegal and dangerous. Until Mikhail Gorbachev came along. With his policy of glasnost, or openness, citizens were allowed to protest. One of the first open acts of protest was against the proposed opening of phosphate mines in Estonia in 1986, which would not only be an environmental disaster, but would also mean more native Russians coming into Estonia to work in the mines. It was no secret that one of the Soviet Union's tactics to tear away at the cultural fabric of their republics was to place Russian settlers in those territories. Beginning in 1987, Estonians began holding mass demonstrations, which usually included singing national songs that had been banned by the Soviet Union. In 1988, nearly a quarter of all Estonians attended a song festival in Tallinn and called for the country's independence. In addition to old national songs, musicians wrote new songs. One of the best known is No Land is Alone, my chosen title for this podcast episode, written by Alo Mattison and Yuri Liismant. It's about the bond that ties everyone from Estonia together, and it became a national hit. Here it is, sung in 2008 by the same musicians who performed it in 1988. At the same time, Lithuania and Latvia were having their own singing revolutions. At the Latvian Song and Dance Festival in 1985, the choir performed the nationalist song Gaismas Pils, despite it being explicitly banned by Soviet officials. In 1987, the Rock March in Lithuania encouraged resistance against the Soviets. All these events assisted the nationalist groups in each country in gaining a stronger following, and allowed them to start planning something big, something that the world couldn't ignore. In 1989, the Baltic states gathered to make their giant declaration of independence. About a quarter of the Baltic population joined hands, forming an enormous human chain. This chain, known as the Baltic Way, connected all the capital cities and stretched over 400 miles. 2 million people participated, and even more if you consider the demonstrations of solidarity that then took place in major cities around the world, including Berlin, Toronto, Melbourne, and even Moscow. The giant human chain not only brought international awareness to the Baltic cause, but also brought hope to similar movements around the world. For example, some historians credit it with accelerating the German reunification process. This may all sound peaceful, music, singing, holding hands, and it was for the most part, but it wasn't without risk. The Soviet Union killed multiple unarmed protesters in the Baltic nations in the years leading up to its dissolution. But in the end, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were the first 3 Soviet republics to declare their independence. There has been some speculation about how the Baltic singing revolution was so successful. You could argue that the Soviet Union was already on its last legs, but I think it was successful because the Baltic people had practice in forming a wall of musical solidarity. This wasn't the first time that Estonia used the power of music to successfully protest. The International Center on Nonviolent Conflict suggests that Estonia used songs as a weapon as early as the 13th century in response to German conquerors. Estonia had been preparing for its late 20th century singing revolution for hundreds of years. Also, the genre of music is important. This wasn't a revolution driven by punk music or pop music or any other genre that is generally linked to one generation or subgroup. This was the kind of music that every Estonian learned as a child and heard at song festivals growing up. These songs are written on the hearts of Estonians, young and old, and they are a vessel for Estonian culture. In this month's Patreon blog post, I will discuss the idea of music as an expression of a nation in more detail, and I will also discuss some of the science around the psychological and physical effects of singing when you are experiencing trauma, like the Baltic World War II refugees. You can find my Patreon at patreon.com/folkfilespodcast. This is usually where I encourage you to reach out to me on social media or via email with questions or comments or corrections, and please do. But this week I have a self-correction, or perhaps just a question regarding Tom of Bedlam. In last month's episode, I said that there was a sister hospital to Bedlam Hospital called St. Mary Magdalene. I learned that tidbit from the Wattersons' album notes and took it at face value. But when doing later research, I couldn't find any proof of that hospital's existence. So perhaps there was no women's asylum called St. Mary Magdalene, or perhaps there was and the Wattersons have access to some sneaky resources that I don't know about. In any case, apologies for the questionable statement. I will leave you with a little bit more of Tuiga, the traditional final song of each Laulupidu, and a quote from choir conductor Aino Magi. She said that when she was a child, her father taught her music and said that music is an education I can give you. Nobody can ever take this from you. It's worth more than material or wealth. Thank you for listening.